Shri Ravindran, and from Delhi, and well-known Bombay urbanist Kaiwan Mehta. May I invite them to come inside? I think all the panelists are outside. No, Gautam's here. Huh? Kaiwan's also here. Can someone get Katie? So please take your seats and we'll start in another 2 minutes. Thank you.
Are you going to stick around? Yeah, sure. Rush for an appointment. Thank you so much for coming. We'll talk. Yeah, we'll talk. Thank you. Where are you? There you are. Thank you. I'm glad you were to spot. Good job. Thank you so much. Thank you. Let's do this.
Oh, nice of you.
Let's do this.
You'll probably get a call from Vinita.
Okay.
And anyway, I'll talk to you.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, good morning and welcome. So I am very, very honored to be moderating this session today with two people whose work and practice and thinking I admire very, very much. On my right is Ravindran, who I don't know how quite to introduce. As he was telling me just at morning that he wrote his first article in 1969. So it's been a while, and decades of practice, School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi Urban Arts Commission, public newspaper writing, now building a new school in the built environment in Amity. I think there are very few people who have moved from the positions of private practice, architectural practice, urban design. He told me in the middle that he just stopped in the middle to do pottery and then came back to design and practice. So there is a tremendous biography of practice to be here. But for today, we're just happy that you're with us and that we get to hear you think this morning. On my left, Kaiwan Mehta, who is also pulling writing on architecture, stretching it to the limits of the discipline. Part of Domus, writing out his own book that's outside. I recommend highly, Alice in Buleshwar. And we have been tasked today in a conversation called A City in the World, which is quite a specific, pointed, narrow topic. You know, it's clear what it means to all of us. But so we decided to take it quite literally and actually talk about cities and really try and think about what it means to read the world from the city. The format that I'm going to use, particularly because we have such a rich audience is to be very disciplined and allow myself only 3 questions to both of them. They'll both respond, after which I will open it up. So the first of the 3 that we thought, yesterday we had a set of really interesting provocations, partly from Rohan, also who's sitting here, on cinema in the city and thinking together these different forms of reading and belonging in the city, particularly for someone like him who's also trained as an architect, right? And I want to, in some sense, come back to this idea of reading and listening to cities. In this panel, we have a little bit of freedom right now to step back from the script and focus on the city, on the festival. And I think we're going to take the first question to do that. And so one place where I thought we'd start, and Katie, I'll ask you to respond first, is to actually step away from a moment from our immediacy and say, what are the cities in the world that, if we take some that have provoked you or that you have read in certain ways, how do we think and approach cities? What do they mark for us as spaces of learning and insight in our life? So I've asked both Katie and Kaiwan to think of 3 cities, here or elsewhere, and read them for us, to actually talk a little bit about what those cities symbolize. And in that, hopefully, I think the question of form will be back, because you will think about how each of them, coming from their different practices and sensibilities, experience and read cities very, very differently. So why don't we start there? 3 cities in the world for you to read, perhaps through the social spatial form question, but in any other register that you'd like.
Well, I would think that the 3 most important cities I can think of in the world. Am I audible?
No, not really.
Yeah?
Maybe a bit higher up.
Because I don't speak too loud.
No, yeah, a little bit of a dead. Now, just speak.
Yeah. Can you hear now?
Yeah. I think it's just a little bit loose. And I think this. Are you comfortable with it?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's voice activity.
So, if you ask about 3 cities in the world, I would think there would be New York, Istanbul, and Banaras. I would think are the 3. 3 cities to which I relate most. Sorry, I think
Take that
flash.
off, yeah.
Yeah.
So, these are 3 cities to which I can react very directly. Istanbul I've been only twice, but that place is so intense that even one visit is enough to captivate you. As you know, it's also one of the most written about cities. Almost the whole range of Orhan Pamuk's work is on Istanbul, and Istanbul informs the way he approaches any subject. I mean, he mixes all the layers of history, and it's such an important city, Istanbul, that if it was not an Islamic country, I think it would have been as important or as visited as Rome. It's actually quite a stunning city with fabulous layering of histories. The whole of Turkey is like that. But Istanbul really has an intensity which no other city has. And I think when a city engages its writers through fiction, I think that city has arrived. If somebody writes fiction about a city, that means the city has arrived. And Istanbul is written about so many times, so many films are made on Istanbul. And like directly dealing with the city as a character in the film, not just using the city as a prop for a background or using sequence of spaces there to narrate a story, but using the city as a character, playing an active role in the development of the narrative. So I think that's when a city has arrived. And Istanbul, I think, is one of the finest cities I've been to, and I'd like to go back there again and again if I can. Secondly, about New York, I've been some 15 times to New York, and I've spent quite a lot of time there, though I've never worked or lived there. But New York has also another kind of intensity. In fact, that's the only city in the world. There is no, all other cities are some kind of an approximation between a city and a suburb. If you look at New York, it's like really, really city with a capital C. And it's so intense, the place, and the public spaces and the walking spaces are so huge, and that you encounter all kinds of people. And it's so terribly multicultural that you sit in the tube and in front of you will be 15 different nationalities sitting across the tube. And apart from this, it is also a place of power. It's also a place for money. It's a place for glamour. And it's most importantly a place in which most citizens of New York are slightly kinky. There's something different about a New Yorker. You see a New Yorker in any other part of even America itself, you run into a New Yorker, you can figure out that he or she is a New Yorker because there's something different, strange, quirky, quick, and maybe even fleetingly mad about them. And that means that city has really engaged its citizens, and the citizens are really engaged with it. So every time I went to New York, I've had the privilege of walking around the city right across so many times, and have really had the opportunity to drink its rus, the city's rus. And so New York, I think, is a very important global city. Now, the third important city is Banaras. And Banaras very strangely shares quite a few characters of New York. It's also built to edge like New York is, largely in the older part of the city. It's got, of course, Banaras is a walking, cycle rickshaw and scooter kind of city, whereas New York has got very well differentiated roads with kind of automobiles and pedestrians all defined. But Banaras has, I think the Ghats of Banaras is almost inhuman in its scale, inhuman in a positive way. I don't mean inhuman in a negative way. And it's not possible that it's built by humans. It's like that complex, that huge in scale, that intense, that overpowering, and so its reverential content is so strong that even an atheist like me, when I walk down on the Ghats, I feel very different from walking around in any other place. Besides this, the Banarsi people are traditionally scholars, musicians. They make some of the finest textiles. They have a great tradition of wooden toys, and they have great traditions of philosophy and learning. In fact, Banaras is really what Banaras is supposed to be, the heart of Indian, I wouldn't call it culture because culture would be too narrow a word, heart of the essence of India in some way. And it also is very, unlike we think about it as a Hindu city, it also has a very influential, huge population of Muslims. Parshvanath, who is a Jain prophet, was born there. Guru Ravidas of the Sikh tradition was born there. It's a really charged city, and Buddha broke his silence in Sarnath, as you know. That is the first place where he preached when he came down from the mountain to the marketplace. He spoke to people in Sarnath after 8 years of silence. So Banaras is a very, very caste place. And the people in Banaras are also slightly crazy. I mean, it's a very interesting thing that the intensity of a city can actually impact the way people live their lives so strongly. It's visibly so that there's a kind of that heady Banarasi pan. Many of them are like high on dope. They smoke like crazy. There's a lot of bhang going around. There are all kinds of things happening. There's that most unbelievable traditions linked to rituals of burial, rituals of burning, so on. There's a whole community of what has been called, narrowly called cannibals, people who eat dead bodies. There are many rituals, secret rituals, which happen on Banaras Ghats, using, the kind of Devdasis come and dance on a particular moonless night around the burning ghats. It's a really quite a mad place, Banaras. And it actually has most of its citizens high with the city. That's the only way I can describe it. So I would say that these three are the most critical cities which I have experienced as places.
Thanks, Kitty. It's tremendous because it makes so many connections between the conversations we've had over the last couple of days. I mean, Rohan argued yesterday about the city not being a container, not an incidental location, but not passive, but a character. I think the idea of the city being a character, one that compels you to write the novel, not the one that you write the novel about, is a very interesting way to put agency back to the city as opposed to seeing it just as space. And I also think it's really wonderful that in the three cities you've picked, the very complex geopolitical sense of power is so present. Right? And in a panel thinking about the city and the world, it is really important to think about our notions of great cities being constantly mediated, that Istanbul will never be narrativized or branded or sold or moved like New York. Right? Modernity can come from Vienna, can't come from Cairo. And I think that's partly in urban theory, as you know, the debate that's so far on is for us recognizing suddenly that we have inherited these very particular ways of speaking about cities, where the canonical list you portrayed would be very, very eccentric, would be very, very unusual, and the connections that you made across the craziness of Banaras and New York, which is a claim of sort of elevation, right? And Istanbul, right? A claim of elevation, a globality of a different order. Not the global cities of a Saskia Sassen's framework, not the global cities of economic power, but global cities that are able to elevate from place, where their citizens absorb them in certain ways, a very different kind of globality. Thank you so much for that. Kaiwan, when I asked you this question in the morning, your response was, actually, I've been in a situation where you've been in a situation of having to work across three very widely different cities in a very short period of time. And I'm going to play your hand a little bit and tell the audience what they were, because you talked about Bombay, Abu Dhabi, and Stuttgart, which are three peculiar places to inhabit for a year. So tell us about a year in the life of Kaiwan Mehta in Bombay, Abu Dhabi, and Stuttgart.
Actually, there was a short text which I wrote, which very few people have read, called Traces in the Life of a Stranger. It has 13 short stories, which actually came out of this transition over about 4 or 5 years across 3 different places. This is fine?
It's fine.
Yeah. So there's also Bangalore that came in the picture, but somehow Bangalore doesn't work for me. So it's like a little bit of a blind spot in a certain way. But Bangalore was also part of life in that same period. So this was basically when I had practically finished Alice. We were in the last stages of editing and cleaning or whatever, and I said, let me just develop a project where I will look at Stuttgart. At the end of about 3 months, I realized that I was not heading anywhere. One reason simply I thought was very technical, which is to say that in Germany, even tourist literature is written in German. So how do you access material? But I thought at one point I realized that it was about a certain way of seeing, and what happened is when I was discussing this with the director, who I share a very close relationship with, and he said, let me take you for a walk of the city. And which was, Stuttgart is not a walker city, it is a driving city. So we took a van one morning and we traveled, and he took me, it's also a city of many hills. So he took me to some of these certain locations, and he said, that's how you see it, that's where the warplanes came in the Second World War. This is a certain duke, this was, so you get that sense. And what it struck me was, I landed up, because of working on Bhuleshwar Kalwa Devi, landed up always taking people to see the place. And I said, what did I get of this city in 2 hours? And it started making me think, what do others get in 2 hours when I take them around? And also this sort of navigation, which also comes because of the architect's preoccupation, that this book came essentially out of walking in the streets. And I remember at one point Arpita telling me, suddenly like frantically calling me, that there's no map in the book. So I said, if till the end of the book we never felt the need for a map, then that means we don't need a map. And that was sorted. Whereas here, just because of the geography of the place, and also as I said, it's not a walker's city, it's Mercedes and all of them, all the companies are there in that location. And it's a huge industrial history as well. You sort of saw the city in this sort of bird's eye view at all points in time if you had to understand the city. So this sort of get me thinking, in what positions do we play, or what roles do we play, or what positions do we keep ourselves in to sort of find a familiarity with the city. And at the same time, I also felt in this sort of, because one was suddenly traveling quite a lot in a very short period, so I can say, one traveled in a matter of 6 months, I must have kind of traveled to at least 4 cities. And that's quick for a certain sort of a mentality where every place you're sort of trying to get something. And what also emerged, which has sort of become a very important, character or trope for me, which is the idea of the stranger. Sort of also being alone in certain places. And what does it mean to be alone as a traveler? But there are many occasions when I have understood Bombay by being alone in Bombay. And the question of interiority of loneliness, or the interiority of urban spaces where you are alone in crowds. So these were certain things which were, I think they were there in my Bombay experience, they got heightened in these locations. And a similar thing happened sort of trying to work on the Abu Dhabi pavilion for the Venice Biennale. The working method that the curator had.
Hold on a second. The Abu Dhabi pavilion in the Venice
Biennale, yeah.
I just want to mark that very peculiar location.
Yeah. In a sense, Venice Biennale. No. Yeah, so I'll tell you. So in the UAE politics, there's Dubai and Abu Dhabi, like you have Bombay and Delhi. So there is always a pit. So the official the official UAE pavilion in the Venice Art Biennale was largely focused on, and also the development, that was the period when Guggenheim and all of them were going to Abu Dhabi, and that politics had started playing up on an international scale. So there was also this sort of resistance from within Abu Dhabi to sort of go international in that way, because if you look at Dubai and Abu Dhabi as 2 cities, Dubai is much more international, Abu Dhabi is still a very 70s, 80s city. So there was this whole sort of conversation opening up on the question of Asian cities, which is where I got pulled in, and the mode of working was just traveling across cities. So workshops we didn't do anything, we just sat in a bus or a car and traveled from place to place and just met people. So it was over about 6 months of these random 4-5 day trips. I started sort of getting a sense of what Abu Dhabi is, and it sort of got planned only in the 70s. Till then it was still a lot of mud houses so it also sort of struck me, it's, what even Bombay I say is a young city. Bombay is about 150-200 years old, as against Delhi, which has, the Mughal presence in Delhi is something that defines Delhi. For Bombay, it is the 19th century that defines Delhi. And here was a city which was 25-30 years old in that sense. And again, sort of walking in the city very often, late nights, etc., you realize this play up of neighborhoods. So these cities, especially Dubai, Abu Dhabi, through their splashes of sort of images and colors and all of them, but they operate very multicultural, they operate at a neighborhood scale in a certain way. So you sort of got tossed around between sort of places, and a lot of people would wonder why I enjoy Stuttgart, but I think for me it sort of gave me a different kind of a space from Bombay. It worked in a very different way. It had a space, it has its speed in a very different way. Because I remember once sort of during the Biennale sitting in the plaza at Venice and calling up a friend in Stuttgart and saying, I'm missing Stuttgart. So she said, you must be the only idiot who sits in Venice and then misses Stuttgart. But it was, because Venice did not hold any charm for me after its sort of initial introduction in a certain way. But these were also, especially as against sort of Bombay, Abu Dhabi and Stuttgart, had these queer existences as cities. Very important, but their pace was very, very, very different, and they worked at a very different sort of, they were not jumping into the global like Dubai would jump. I guess if I had to do work on Dubai, it would have been not fun. But sort of because of the internal politics within Abu Dhabi and its development, and you could see a certain kind of a, because the first planner was an Egyptian who studied in Cairo, then went to Munich at the height of like the modern planning being taught within German universities, comes back, designs Riyadh, etc., and then gets invited to design Abu Dhabi. So even that sort of crazy planning history of a planner was interestingly visible in the city. So it was this sort of journeying in and out. So you've left Asia, you've gone to Europe, you're living there, and you're coming back sort of halfway down to another part of Asia and talking on Asian cities. And there's another perspective, and as you said, like we talk of cities from a certain European obviously training, but we've grown up enough, I think now, although I went through my training at CSCS, which was a very important thing to sort of understanding or learning the methods of shifting conversations or dialogues, and then you're talking about Asian cities. So I think it was this interesting churning between places and ideas that happened in that period.
Thank you. I'm happy on two counts. One, I'm very happy that Katie used the word kinky and you used the word queer, which means there's obviously an interesting purchase about what urban life does to us. And so, having the two of you here, I can't not ask this next question, which is that you're both trained as architects, right? But you're both, Katie's trained at this point as a lot of things, but also as an architect. But you're also architects who write, right? And insist on writing. And we go back again to this question of modes of work and practice. Right? So why do architects write? What do architects write when they write about? Right? And what is the difference between, because from a lot of us who were trained in the social science and the humanities, we always had this building envy. At the end of the day, you built something. I built a critique, and now I have it. It's one of those. So I'm very interested in particularly this, because our universities still make this absurd distinction between technical education, professional education, and liberal arts education, as if they're different registers of thinking. But as someone so involved in in different registers of writing, and writing a book in which, instead of Alice in Bhuleshwar, very nicely on the back, you're described as an urbanist, not an architect. So because it's not building icon spectacle, we all become urbanists instead of being designers and architects. And I want almost to ask you to reclaim Alice in Bhuleshwar as a book about architecture, written by an architect, right? To refuse this distinction between form and building city, and this distinction across scale, this distinction across discipline, but talk a little bit about the various kinds of writing you've done about architecture and why it's so important for you as an architect to write. And then, Katie, I'll bring the same question to you, but to ask you really to reflect from someone who has written columns in newspapers, who's written about art, who has insisted in writing about the technicality of materials and technology, not just the aesthetic book of architecture in India after 1990. So to think again both about the publicness of writing, to think about the content of that writing, but to think about architects who write about cities. Kaiwan, you want to start?
Yeah. So actually, writing really doesn't exist. I think now it's a little better, but it really doesn't exist within the playfield of architecture. It's always some kind of a extra or a parallel activity that you do. It's not your mainstream professional. Yeah. And I have to say very frankly, this is something that I've learned more from the arts, or maybe because I was also very close to the arts circuit or the arts area in Bombay. Learned a lot from Nancy, Arajanya, Ranjit, Postcote in that sense. The question that writing is a form of production. It is not simply an elaboration put into words of what you saw, but it is a mode of thinking. So I think Alice in Bhuleshwar was sort of more natural in that sense, because as I was discussing yesterday, its initial sort of ideas came from the Sarai Fellowship, where we were supposed to write in a sort of a report every month. And those took the form of essays. And it's also this distinction where in architecture you have so-called writers who basically just take text and clean it up or embellish it, and that's writing. Where here you had to, the mode of writing was the mode of thinking. The mode of writing was the mode of production of thought, the production of ideas. That becomes something, and I have to say that it was actually in Germany where I got recognized as a writer. Otherwise, I don't want to do this sort of India and abroad kind of a thing, but here everybody just saw you as an architect who's trained but likes to teach and write. You are left at that in a certain way. It was actually abroad where very often suddenly I would get placed within panels as writer, or I was offered a sort of an exchange fellowship as a writer. So that was the sort of first thing of, because it is important because you're doing work and you're not realizing what you're doing till sort of somebody puts a mirror in a certain way to you. But I think that is just an important thing to sort of then also stress, that when one is writing about architecture, it is literally, and this is I think the problem when you write on architecture, on art, on literature, that it is not that something that you have produced and now I will produce another elaboration on that, or I will sort of rephrase, articulate what you have said. But the fact that criticism or review is a form that stands by itself, because there is further knowledge produced in the form of the criticism. So especially for architecture, that it is not that you're describing or saying something about a building, but you're producing architecture in the act of writing on architecture. Architecture or the city is not, city we know, so let's leave. Architecture is not only produced in the act of making building. And I think that has been the struggle with Domus, because even with my earlier two editorial positions, I think I've also been able to sort of articulate this much better in the last sort of 6, 7, 8 years or so. Once one did that more subconsciously, but that, so you then look at journalism or criticism as an act of production. You say, I don't care what you think, but I will talk about buildings like this. And you take it or you don't take it, and I have to say most architects take it and enjoy it. Yeah.
Katie, can I ask you to take us to 1969 and that first article and the writing since?
Sorry. I went to architecture school in the 60s, from 63 to 68, and graduated in 68. I'm sure I'm the oldest person in this hall. And I started my practice straight away. But in the 60s, Corbusier was like God. You know, if you couldn't do a watercolor well of brutalist concrete wall, you can't design. You don't know how to design, or you are outdated. So, sorry.
Just a little closer, maybe.
So Corbusier was literally God for all of us. And I remember that in my hostel, I had across my window on two sides. One side I had a sketch which I made of Corbusier. With, in those days, 6B pencil sketching was like the ultimate. You arrive when you can sketch with 6B pencil. Which
the last generation that did 6B pencils.
Right.
Yeah.
So on one side I had a Corbusier sketch, and on the other side I had Oscar Niemeyer. So I had admired both these people immensely at that time. So if you don't write in the newspaper, the government doesn't hear. You know, if you want something to be heard, you write in the newspaper, and they hear it. They see it, they read the newspaper, and they hear what you're saying. So it's really an opportunity to influence public thinking, public policy, rather than, you know, kind of creating consciousness about architecture or the city. So, I must say that I was not motivated by informing other architects, but I was more motivated by, kind of raising issues in the public, so that people, ordinary people who read newspaper, will start thinking about, the city more than just about architecture. So after urban design, it's very difficult to go and confine yourself to a plot. You don't think about the building. You think about the city, you think about the fabric, you think about the structure in which the building is just another building block of the city. In other words, as an architect, you're already writing the city in some way, because you're in fact producing, you're a part of the production process of the city. And the way you think and you write about it has far-reaching consequences on the quality of life that you generate in the city. So later, I wrote many times in the first inaugural issue of A+D. They said you write about whatever you like. And I wrote an article called Vernacular Values. I still read that article once in a way, I enjoy it. And 10 years later, they asked the same authors to write on the same topic. So I wrote something completely different 10 years later. In other words, I'm saying just like I have a right to express myself, I also have the right to change my opinion. I also have the right to reposition myself vis-a-vis the environment. And I think if that doesn't happen, if you don't remain vulnerable to the city, to quote Krishnamurti, to be vulnerable is to live, to withdraw is to die. So that vulnerability is a very critical factor, I think, for an architect who is practicing, who's teaching, who's writing, who's communicating in so many different ways. These are all modes of communication. They're just different modes of communication. Ultimately, they're just communication. So education as well. So I taught for about 30 years in SPA, and during that time I produced lots of articles on various topics, materials and systems, and some pure theory and all kinds of things about cities, about urban design, a lot of anti-planning articles I did in the newspaper. And I did a column for Economic Times one time. It was called Building Storm. And I did another column for Hindustan Times, which was called Metro Mind. So it was every 2 weeks you produce a small thing, about 500 words. But you take a position about something that's very contemporary in the city. And that's engaging the citizens and you equally about what's happening in the city. So that's a great opportunity to communicate to people. And if one can do that in the vernacular press, I think it'll be even better. But unfortunately, I don't have I know I can read and write Malayalam, and to an extent Tamil, but I don't have the capacity to write in that language. So I still write in English. But this is, my last article was also in the newspaper. I wrote about the Chennai Floods, about how the whole nexus between politics, power, land markets, etc. has destroyed the complete watershed management plan which could have been made for Chennai. So I have a lot to say, but I think that's enough.
No, that's great. So I had one more, but I'm going to withdraw it. And I will come back to it because I want quick response, because then I will open it up.
Yeah. So just 2-3 things also to elaborate a little bit on the earlier question. I think the Oscar Nemia example that Katie brought up. So I think in the question of writing, it has also been, at least within, I think, architecture, to open up forms of address in that sense. So I think from the classic sort of note or essay writing, the form of the interview that we have been sort of discussing, or the form of the biography, and to sort of, and I think the other thing that I wanted to pull out, as much as I grew up in this sort of writing on the city and writing on architecture within the city, at least for me, there's a bit of a 360 turn right now, and which is also evident in Domus, which is to say that, yes, everything is there, but I want to write on architecture. So I want to sort of bring architecture back to the center. You talk of materiality, you talk of urbanity, you talk of all of these things through the architect, which is not to say that the architectural object is just an object in the plot, but to say that that's the essential lens, and that engagement is important. So I think, and then you sort of talk about the city. So in that sense, whether it's Alice or it's Gautam Bhatia's Punjabi Baroque, if one was to go to, or Neera Adarkar's book on which she edited on the chawls in Bombay, I think those are important structures where the architectural format becomes a way of engaging with the question of culture or with the question of of urbanity. And there's Kamu Iyer, who's written right now this wonderful book, which is a memoir, but it basically just talks of the different typologies he encountered in the city, and then talks about the history of the urban development through those different buildings that he encountered in the city. So that's possible to do, and that's something that is sort of coming up more and more evidently.
Floor is open. I'll take two at a time. One at the back over there. We'll start. It's on, just be. It's on.
One point which I have to ask is, you talked in detail about your experience in different cities, and you have in fact explained what is it. What I found is what signifies for you in that particular city, whether it's a power or it could be certain politics, etc. So my question here is, how do you see the city? Do you see the city as a form, subject, or a medium, which would, in different times, in different phases, would mirror your mindscape and thoughts? Because, like, I just want to quote one more point, like in yesterday's discussion, which Paramita was talking about, when you see a film, it's a very crowded landscape. You would pick what you want to see, what you want to think. So it could be, again, because of your perceptions, politics. So how do you look at city and engage city, whether it's a form or a subject or a medium? Thank you.
Let me take one more before you listen. What? Kira? It's on only. It comes on when you speak.
Yeah. So I had a question for Professor K.T. Ravindran. You talked about this quirkiness that people develop when they stay in cities that have, which have a very strong character. I was just wondering, what happens to such people when they've been staying in a city like that for many years, let's say a few decades, and you pull them out of that city and place them somewhere else in another city, which is, are they, so the thought that was sort of coming to my mind was that these are cities where a lot goes on, and they are in a way porous cities, because there are different communities staying there. They are cities that are sort of open, there's a lot of openness to the city, there's a lot of porosity to the city. The city allows others to come in, it allows a lot of absorption. And yet, the people who've always stayed there, I think when they are pulled out of that city, they are not so porous themselves. And so when they step out, are they able to adapt? Are they as adaptive as the cities that they have sort of been pulled out of? I mean, that was just I was just wondering.
You want me to get Kaiwan to start? Kaiwan, will you respond first? He has a mic already.
Ah.
This is free, whenever
You didn't ask me, but I'll respond to your question.
Both.
Yeah, I will. I would just sort of place the question, not that I have many thoughts on it, but just as a thing. Maybe the person is porous, but the city he or she went to is not porous enough. That can also be the problem. Not all cities are porous and open. So that can be the mismatch, I think, because there are ways which people develop within certain urban formats and structures, which is why certain other urban formats work for you, certain don't, but it's also how the city responds to your own structure which you have taken there, whether it's your method of walking or whether it's the way you address people. So I think in all those ways, it's also the other urban format, how open or not is it. If I understood the question, no, in a sense, cities are landscapes. They are landscapes of heavy activity and heavy sort of sedimentation of history. Obviously, you chart out your path in every place. And I think that's the crucial point. I think it's fine when we do it sometimes as undergraduate teachers or talking that, you say this is about power, this is about politics, this is about culture, this city is about this city is about that. but in the experience a city does not really exist. It also sort of, you know, which part of the cities you want to access, or you struggle to access, or you try to access, and how you receive it. So I think in that sense you define every time, and also in partly bringing back the response that I gave to her, that within your interaction between you and the city, you define that what the city is about, rather than sort of pinning it down. But I also have a thesis which is more elaborate. I'll briefly say that cities have what, you know, we say this is very Bombay, this is very Delhi. I think all cities have moments of urbanity, and then those moments of urbanity, they are not there all the time, but cities only live on that moment of urbanity. So what I would say, for example, like Delhi achieves its moment of urbanity with the Mughals. It's very important to understand that, to understand Delhi. And then it would be sort of the moment of the early 20th century independence. Like Bombay and Calcutta, I would say their moment of urbanity is the 19th century, after which Calcutta doesn't have another moment of urbanity, but Bombay has another in the 1990s. So these, for me, the time positions are much more important than sort of one word associations with cities.
I'll take your question first. I would completely agree with the way Kaiwan put it, that it's really not about any one layer. It's multiple layers all the time, interacting, interplaying all the time, and you immerse yourself as an active agent into that form, and then there's no question of defining it in any one way. You are influenced by the form, you are influenced by the social structure, you are influenced by the networks, you are influenced by its politics, you are influenced by everything that happens in that city. And being open to those influences is more critical, I think, for us as people who actually produce the city, because then we have our pulse on how the city's systems are functioning.
Produce our
And
cities,
yeah, and that's, I think, is a critical part in that. So it need not be defined in any one particular way. Now, to your question about a displaced person, do we have any EPDP colony people from Delhi here? Yeah.
Vishwa.
All right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, in fact, they can answer this best, I think, because
No, my question is going to be an extension of that same question.
wait for me to finish and then you can ask the question. So apart from Banaras, I feel Calcutta is also another city which has deeply influenced the psyche of the citizens of Calcutta. And there is a quirkiness in Calcutta as well. For instance, every second Bengali you meet is a social scientist, whatever his profession may be. Yeah? They have theories about society and how it functions. They think politically. There's a collectiveness in the city, and that collectiveness, plays itself out as the adda in the residential areas, or the coffee house, or the university venues. There are many different places where, they come together. Unlike in Delhi, you are for a long time, you only had to go to Nirulas to find 5 other people. Otherwise, there was no 5 other people together in Delhi. So now, of course, there are more places. But Calcutta has that tradition, an urban tradition of developing a collective thinking, collective opinions, collective psyche. And when the Calcuttan is taken out and brought to a place like Delhi, which is damn difficult for an outsider to negotiate, to begin with, because it's an agglomeration of a series of impervious networks and systems. Delhi is like that, from one reading. So it's very difficult for someone who comes from outside to enter that network. Now, of course, they can go to Gurgaon and then come to work in Delhi, so you have a more cosmopolitan culture to relate to, and then you can come back to connect to Delhi. So, but I think people who have first-hand experience, like EPDP colony, people who live in the EPDP's East Pakistan Displaced Persons Colony. It's the Bengali neighborhood of Delhi. And I think there are a lot of people who are kind of dislocated, not just displaced, from Calcutta, because sense of locality is so strong in Calcutta. So perhaps one of them can explain what that feeling is. Himadri, would you like to venture?
Can we get to the mic, please?
No, one mic is there. You can keep it there.
No. Keep it there. Shall I keep that with Vishwas? Keep that with It's on.
So I don't know if I can really answer your question of what happens, but the question, it really becomes about trying to recreate through events, through through the whole year, through conversations or engagements around familiar territory, which would be maybe the fish market or maybe certain other things, or the temple, or some other sort of an area of a point of concentration. But I do, in a way, I do sort of second her question from the perspective of, for example, people from Mumbai. They find it very difficult to sort of fit into other cities, whereas I find people from Delhi, like myself, have a level of kind of like a buffer. City. That's the good city, or is it something else?
Hemantri, I thought you were going to give an answer.
I just chose the opportunity.
Right, I'll let that question stand.
No, I think there was one more question.
Okay, so my question is to both the architects, and since both of you are coming from cities where the cities are expanding horizontally to other outskirts like the NCR in Delhi or the Navi Mumbai, my question to both of you is that this evolution of the organized urban aesthetic, is that a thing of the past? And does that have anything to do with privatization? For example, DDA was the aesthetic of Delhi till the 60s or the 70s, when DDA was building not only apartments but also a lot of private houses. And there was a certain aesthetic, a certain horizontal aesthetic that was happening. But while in Gurgaon we see it's like a template multiplication that is happening in one quarter, and then another template comes up for the next 10 years that gets multiplied. So you have Belgian glass buildings coming out. The shipbuilding is absolutely one plagiarized great piece of architecture which NCR takes pride in. Navi Mumbai has its own great quarters of architectural pride. So is that to do with privatization? Is that to do with the fact that we have more money, we would like to live abroad, so we can have a lemon county in Noida, or we can have a great something square in Ghaziabad? So,
Can I take that question? I think this is a very interesting question because it touches a very new kind of nerve that the Indian cities are developing. Because there is, on the one hand, you have this globalized financial markets which are trying to gain control over land in India, particularly in Indian cities, because that's where the money can be made back faster. And on the other hand, there is a groundswell of people. So simultaneously, you have this outcry to, kind of retrieve the road for the people. Let's make new urban places, make low-income communities, and we are looking at participatory planning. All those things are happening on the other side. And parallelly is happening this big investment which is creating all those icons which are being produced in our cities. Many of them like plagiarized, like you're saying about that big tower shipbuilding that's a direct takeoff on a building in Indonesia. Direct, I mean, you can't believe that it's the same. So in Jakarta, you have exactly the same building. And in Gurgaon, you have exactly the same building, designed by a Bombay architect. Or whoever was the original, I don't know.
That's a problem in a lot of them, actually.
Yeah.
The stages of different architects.
Okay. Right. So anyway, the long and short of it is that there is this tension between the global capital and the groundswell in the Indian city. We are just beginning to experience that groundswell. And both are vying to take control over urban space. The large investment, the big building bulk, the taller, higher, more glossy buildings are trying to claim privatized or controlled spaces through various methods of control, and people are trying to recover spaces. So this is happening parallelly in India. It's a very interesting juncture, I think, in Indian urbanism. I don't have any answers to your question, but I think I would like to see this in this kind of polarized way in which the Indian city is negotiating its growth.
Just quickly, in a sense, it may have, or one can say that it has happened at other times also. So there are, if you take 50s and 60s, and especially if you look at Bombay, there is a burst of a certain kind of architecture, because it's post-independence, but post-independence affects Bombay very differently from Delhi. It's the rise of early forms of whatever multinational companies or corporates setting up offices, development of today what we call city center, but at that point still suburbs like Worli, etc. So I think there are moments when there are these surges, and the areas which take those sort of rise in building programs, but also which comes with new typologies. See, all these are moments when we are talking of building typologies, but have typologies of buildings. And then who are the architects? So, as you also know, I just was writing on the work of I.M. Kadri for a long period, and he is somebody who produces, just looking at Hafiz's work for some other reason very closely. See, these are also architects who produce within certain climates. So irrespective of whatever other politics we may have, we'll also have to understand their biographies within climates of production and setting up the architect studio in a very different structure. Like he mentioned very quickly, today architectural projects or urban projects are not coming to architects or planners offices. They are going to management companies within which the architect or the planner is only an employee, like an accountant or an engineer. So also these different forms, at the same time, some of the firms that we know, like whether it's Martand in Delhi or it's Arjun Malik in Bombay, these are also younger generations which are working in these climates in a different way. So I think there are many things that are contributing to certain time periods of burst. And that does define, at least in some sense, a bracket of what we would say aesthetic sensibilities. Yeah.
And you know, as I close the session, the thing that I'd also add then is, you know, like all sessions there are, I can't, no? Yeah, I can't. Okay, sorry. I tried. We'll take them in coffee. Yeah. Yeah. So just the last thought about it, because I think, you know, even in terms of challenging, is we're also talking about formal architectural practice and building in cities that are largely auto-constructed. Right? Cities that are not actually built by either planners or architects. Most of our cities in our form are built by people. Right? The slum, the unauthorized colony, the urban village, the rural village, they're constructed by masons and contractors and small builders. So part of the disjunction we also have is that the political economy of the formal built environment actually today is gaining in power and its footprint in the new expansions of urban areas, whereas the patchwork that defined our original cities was also built in multiple registers. Only a small part of it was within the formal building practice of people who call themselves architects and planners. Right? And to me, the crowding out of the ability to auto-construct, to squat, to inhabit, to occupy, to incrementally grow, that crowding out is changing our urbanism fundamentally, right? Because you can now gate and control and survey. Vacant land is no longer a possibility of a new form. And this, in all these registers, it is a very, very interesting moment for urbanization. As we move from that 35% urban to 50, 60% urban, the spatiality of that is so contested. Many of our cities will be born as enclaves. Will be born as economic zones, will be born along corridors and expressways. Or the Chinese city is telling us that actually there is no such thing as this object, because there is just this endless urban form. You know, when you drive out of Delhi, out to the NCR for kilometers and kilometers, the built environment just doesn't end. So what is this massive conglomeration? What do you do with this? You know, in planning we say UA, urban agglomeration. Because we don't know what the hell else to call it. And I mean, that's really what it is. But it's so I think there are multiple contestations that are happening. And it is critical for our conversations about this urbanism to happen from those multiple viewpoints. And we're still, I mean, this panel can't do that. We're still not being able to put together the different heads of the beast, you know, but the beast is very much in the room. So let me thank both of our panelists for really interesting, very reflective conversations. We have a coffee break, Arpita? We have a 10-minute. Lovely. Yes, you take that.
10-minute coffee break before we move on to the next session, which is an author and conversation session. And we have renowned feminist activist and publisher